Hello, this is Charles Bernard. Welcome to Volume 9, Part 2 of the Art Track video series, which is your alternative to art school. In this series, I analyze paintings for their design and composition. In Part 2, I continue with plans of organization. I started the Art Track video series because in my search for courses on design and composition, I discovered that there are very few sources from which you can learn these most important subjects of art. And the ones that I did find, I felt did not teach these subjects very effectively. So I went ahead and designed an art series in a way that I would have wanted to have someone teach these subjects to me. And the result is the Art Track video series. I had to create a part 2 for volume 9 because I wanted to give you an in-depth knowledge of plans of organization because they are of vital importance to the success of your compositions. When you look at other artists' work, see if you can discover what the plan of organization is that the artist used to organize the composition. But you'll only be able to see these plans if you have a knowledge and understanding of them, which you are now gaining through Volume 9, Part 1 and Part 2. I differ with people who say, look at a great painting and you will learn from that great painting. Well, if you don't know what you're looking for, you can stare at that painting from now until doomsday and not learn one thing. But once you do know what you're looking for, then you'll begin to learn from that great painting. And the Art Track video series is showing you what to look for. And now, let's begin with Part 2. Now, I'd like to get back to plans of organization. I talked about irregularity because it enters into the plans of organization and is referred to as repetition with variation or varied repetition. I did this awful looking rough color sketch that you see here, which has just about everything wrong with it. Later, I will show you a color sketch that was based on a plan of organization. And this color sketch is not based on a plan of organization, and you'll be able to see the difference a plan of organization makes. Without a plan of organization, there is the danger that too many different shapes will be used within the composition, as is in this case. This shape is different from this shape, and that shape is different from this shape, and this shape is different from this one, and this one is different from this shape. Too many different shapes have been used. In addition, there is too much exact repetition without variation, through which contrast can be introduced to make this color sketch more interesting. There is the repetition of this color, repeated again and again without any variation. Then there are these shapes here that are repeated in the same way, again and again without variation. Also, no dominance has been introduced, which would provide unity and help to integrate all of the shapes within this composition. The same value is repeated on these buildings here, again and again without variation. The color sketch needs more strong contrasts to give it interest. Right now it's flat and dull looking because of lack of strong contrasts, which would be provided if repetition with variation were introduced. Variation in the values and colors and sizes of the shapes. There is no unity because there is no dominance. And this shape here is a geometric shape, which is a boring shape. Then you have the wing of this spacecraft touching the edge of this building, which results in a kissing shape, as it's called. Don't have shapes just touching each other like that. It's very disturbing. When a plan of organization, which is a principle of design, as I have mentioned, is selected to organize the elements of design, then you won't wind up with a monstrosity like this. There are different kinds of plans of organization because there are different principles of design. A plan of organization is whatever will bring visual order to the competing elements of design. In this color sketch here, there is no plan of organization that dominates over the parts. Rather, the parts, the individual shapes that make up this composition, is what dominates. But if I apply a plan such as this one, repetition of shape, with gradation of sizes, then that plan will dominate over the parts, because what I'm doing is selecting a shape such as the triangle. It can be any kind of shape. It can be an irregular shape. It doesn't have to be a geometric shape like this. And then I'm repeating that same shape. I'm not repeating a different shape that would then be in conflict with this triangle shape. Rather, I'm repeating the same shape, but I'm varying the size of that shape. And thereby, I have created an arrangement in which the plan of organization dominates over the parts. And this plan consists of two principles of design, repetition as well as gradation. Gradation providing the variety of different sizes that make this arrangement interesting. If gradation were not introduced and strict repetition were used, then I'd wind up with a monotonous, boring arrangement. It is repetition that always enters into a plan of organization. And it is because repetition provides the means through which unity can be achieved, and dominance as well. I'm going to show you a revised version of this color sketch that I did, which is based on this plan of organization. And here it is. As you can see, there is a dramatic difference between this rough color sketch and this monstrosity. This may look like a finish to you, but it's really not. There is still more that I can do to this to make it even better and more effective. But it will do for what I want to show you. Just as in this diagram here, where I used one kind of shape and repeated that with variations of size. Here as well, I used one kind of shape and repeated that with variations of size. That is, I introduced gradation of sizes. And you can see that this shape here is a triangular shape, and that triangular shape has been repeated throughout this composition. You can find it everywhere here. Similarity of shape. It's not exactly the same, and it's not supposed to be. It's enough to have the shape similar and then repeat it over and over in order to create a dominance of shape and a simplicity of shape. That is, I don't have a lot of different shapes. Like in this sketch here, there is this one kind of triangular shape that is repeated again and again. You can see it everywhere here, here, here. Here's a triangle. Now, even on the center of interest, which is right here, as you can see, there are these triangular shapes in the wing. Here, the whole spaceship is triangular. So, the triangular shapes within other parts of the composition are repeated within the spaceship. Within my diagram here, I have a diminishing of sizes of these triangular shapes due to the principle of gradation. And that same principle of gradation of sizes is found in my sketch here. As you can see, I have a large building here, and then a smaller one, and then even smaller ones here. And the same basic triangular or angular shape is repeated, but changed in size, getting progressively smaller in size as the shapes or buildings move into the distance, just as in my diagram here. The sizes get smaller. You can, however, see a variety of sizes here, ranging from a large to a smaller one, to a even smaller one, and then an even smaller one, and smaller one, and then a very small one. Again, the same idea of gradation of sizes is introduced here. I have a lot more shapes here than I do here, of course. This is just an extreme simplification of the plan of organization that I have utilized in this rough color sketch. There are many more shapes, but these shapes are basically all the same. They just have been varied in their size and also somewhat in their shape. I may have made some more narrow, like I'm doing now in this diagram. Some I may have made wider. Some I may have made taller. Some shorter. But basically, they are all angular shapes, all triangular shapes. And that's what unifies them. And that's what makes this so much different than this sketch here, where there isn't that kind of repetition of one basic shape with variations. And that's why there are so many different shapes here competing for attention. In my diagram, as you can see, I've cleaned it up and added additional shapes to more closely represent my color sketch. And as you can see, there is a dominant size here in my color sketch. That dominant size of a shape is represented by this mass of buildings here. And then I have the smaller shapes, as I have already pointed out, just as I have smaller shapes here in my diagram. This group of buildings is seen as one overall mass or shape because they all have a similar value and similar color. Therefore, they're seen as a unified shape. If I made these buildings different in value and color and detail, then they would be competing for attention with each other. But this way, they're simplified due to similar values and colors, and therefore they do not detract attention from the center of interest, which is this spaceship, and they become a dominant mass or shape within the color sketch, just like I have a dominant shape here in my diagram. These buildings are seen as one shape or mass, rather than individual shapes. Now, these shapes are not strict triangles like that. As I already mentioned, they can be referred to as angular shapes. So any shape, irregular or regular, that has angles within it is seen as a triangular shape because a triangle has diagonals, as you know. But it's also referred to as just an angular shape because of the diagonals. So if I make a shape something like this, it has all these diagonals, you see, and therefore it is referred to as an angular shape, or it can be referred to as a triangular shape, because all angular shapes are derivatives or distortions or variations of the triangle shape. So you see, I can introduce different kinds of angular shapes and still maintain a unity of shape because they all have this angularity or triangularity in common, and therefore they all relate, and therefore they produce unity of shape. Now, one thing I'd like to point out to you is that if you create a shape like this, where there is a curve, and there is a vertical, and there is a horizontal, and there is a diagonal, and another diagonal, now you have a mixture of a lot of different shapes, and there is no clear, distinct shape, whether circular, rectangular, or triangular. and therefore this is very confusing. The shapes need to be clear. You need to be able to tell whether they are angular shapes, or curved shapes, or rectangular shapes. If you mix them, you have to mix them in such a way that one dominates. For example, this triangular shape, if I introduce a curve, the rest have to be triangular. They have to dominate over that curve that I introduced. If the shapes do not have a distinctive look, if you can't recognize its character easily, then you can't attain the kind of unity of shape that I created here in this composition. In my color sketch, you can clearly make out that these are angular shapes or triangular shapes. There's no mistake about it. And that's what unifies all these shapes. Now, all the shapes are not angular. I introduced contrasting shapes. If you remember, I talked about the importance of introducing opposing shapes. And in this color sketch, I introduced curving shapes represented by these circles in this diagram. And those curving shapes can be seen here in the road, which is curved, and then in this planet, which is curved, and then part of this sun here, which is curved. So I've introduced a few curving shapes to contrast with the angular or triangular shapes. When you place opposing elements of design together within your composition, like I did here with these shapes, the curving shapes oppose the angular shapes. What happens is that each element of design is intensified by the other, which means that the curved shapes look more curved when next to angular shapes, and angular shapes look more angular when placed next to curved shapes. A warm color, for example, placed next to a cool one, will appear even warmer, and a cool color placed next to a warm one will appear even cooler. So each color is intensifying the temperature of the other through contrast. And so it is with all of the elements of design. As you can see, there are only a few curved shapes, so as not to compete with the angular shapes. If I made too many of these curved shapes, then they would be in competition with the angular shapes, and there wouldn't be a dominance of angular shapes as there is now. You must always try to create a dominance of one particular kind of shape. There should be a majority of one particular kind of shape. This way you'll be able to achieve dominance, and dominance will create unity. And I talked about this in Volume 8 of the Art Track video series. So if you need to learn more about dominance, check out Volume 8. These curved shapes provide balance and relief from all of the angular shapes. Now, depending on what kind of mood that you're trying to create, you can have more or less of the opposing shapes. It all depends on the character contrast that will express the mood you have in mind. The character contrast can be quite dramatic and strong, which means you need a greater amount of contrast between the shapes, which means you need to introduce more opposing shapes, but not so many that you lose the dominance of one kind of shape. If you look at this diagram here, you can see that I introduced an irregular shape here, which contrasts nicely with the more regular triangular shapes. And I did the same thing in my color sketch. You can see those irregular shapes in the trees here. Adding a few irregular shapes within a composition that contains more regular shapes like these buildings adds a nice contrast of shape and a lot of interest to a composition. If your intention is to have more regular shapes dominate, and you introduce these irregular shapes, to contrast with them, make sure that only a few of those irregular shapes are introduced so that they do not compete with the more regular shapes. Like in my diagram here, I only introduced one of these irregular shapes. The dominant shape is still the more regular triangular shape here. Something else I'd like to point out to you, and that is not only did I use curved lines here in these shapes that I showed you earlier, but also on the spacecraft. There are curved lines here that repeat the curved lines elsewhere in the composition, thereby further helping to tie the spaceships into other parts of the composition through repetition of the curve. There are other forms within this color sketch that are repeated with variation in size, just as I repeated these buildings, so I repeated this spaceship. And you can see that it has been repeated with gradation of size. And that kind of repetition with gradation of size can also be seen here in these trees and over here as well. So this plan of organization is applied to various forms within the composition, not just to one kind of form, such as the building, but any additional shapes that I add. I will adhere to this plan of repetition of shape with gradation of sizes. I introduced a third shape into this diagram, as you can see, but that's the limit of the number of different kinds of shapes that I would add to a painting. Otherwise, things will get too complicated. But a shape like this, which is irregular, can be added if that character of the shape is the same as the character of the shape of the dominant shapes. And these dominant shapes are angular shapes, as I've already pointed out. And this irregular shape is also an angular shape because it has these diagonals at the contour, you see, just as these triangular shapes have diagonals. Therefore, the irregular shape is related to the triangular shapes. They are all angular shapes. And therefore, I can introduce this third shape into my composition. Now, this irregular shape that I indicated here in my diagram can be seen in these trees. The irregular shape of the trees contrasts nicely with the more regular shapes of the buildings. This additional irregular shape to the composition helps to add more variety of shape to it, and thereby increase the interest of the composition. The irregular shapes are tied in nicely with the other shapes because all of the shapes are angular shapes. The irregular shape is an angular shape, just as these triangular shapes found in other parts of the composition are angular shapes. So the irregular shapes have something in common with those other shapes. They are all angular shapes, and therefore there is a unity of shape that has been established through this repetition of angular shapes. If you look at the contour of this irregular shape of the tree, you can see that there are triangular shapes that repeat the triangular shapes of these other shapes in the composition. And this is what unifies all of them. Here at the contour of the tree, you can see somewhat the triangular character. You see? It can't be too obvious because it's a tree. I can't make a tree look like this. So there is irregularity at the contour, but not so much that you can't make out some of these triangular shapes or angles that look like part of a triangle. The color sketches I'm going to show you now are going to be very rough, and I'm not interested in how good they look. Rather, I'm interested only in showing you the various plans of organization. the plan of organization for this rough sketch is what you see here. Dominance of size, which means this spaceship dominates. With repetition of shape, this same shape of the spaceship is repeated in the smaller spaceship here. And repetition of object, the same object, which is a spaceship, is repeated down here in the smaller spaceship. And there is variation of size. So repetition with variation of size, just as in my previous plan of organization. The key, however, is repetition. Repetition enters into all of these plans of organization, and it is the most important principle of design in a plan of organization, because it will provide the necessary unity. I'm showing you this color sketch again because I failed to mention something which I just mentioned in this other sketch that you saw, and that is that there is also repetition of object here within this plan of organization. This object, this spaceship, is repeated, and the object of the building is repeated. So there is repetition of object as well as repetition of shape. When I say repetition of shape and object, that doesn't necessarily mean that the repetition of shape will also be repetition of the same object. It can be a different object but have a similar shape. And I'll show you that in other plans. In my diagram, I have 3 shapes. In my sketch, I have 2, and now I added an additional spaceship. So it corresponds more closely to this diagram now. But either way, I could have just left it with 2. It really doesn't matter. It's still repetition of shape with variation of size and dominance of one shape, which is this large spaceship. And the same object has been repeated, the spaceship. So it's this plan here. And it's the plan that dominates over the parts, and not the parts. Into this plan, I could introduce a different kind of shape that is different from this irregular shape. And if you look to this diagram here, I'll indicate a circle, which acts as a major contrast of shape. The contrasting shape doesn't have to be that extreme. I could indicate one that is less extreme, such as the rectangle shape. There's still contrast of shape, but no longer as extreme as before. But I think for this sketch, I'm going to use the more extreme contrast of shapes. And as you can see, I introduced these circular shapes here, thereby providing me with a major contrast of shape within this color sketch and helping to make it even more interesting. Although this is a very rough color sketch, as I've already stated, I'm not interested in making a perfect composition here. This plan of organization is pretty much the same as the other plan that I showed you, but I wanted to show you another application of the same or similar kind of plan to a different color sketch, so that you can see how the same plan can be applied to different paintings. Using this rough color sketch that I did, I'd like to show you a different kind of plan of organization from the 2 that I've shown you so far. And this plan is repetition of shape with variation of object. All these principles that I have listed here, they all can act as a plan to organize these elements of design. But the plans of organization always involve repetition, because that is the foremost principle of design in these plans of organization. Through repetition, simplicity and unity can be achieved. Repetition of shape plays an important part in these plans of organization, as I have shown you in the previous plans, in which I repeated shapes throughout the composition, and through which unity was easily achieved. Now, in my rough color sketch here, the plan of organization that I used here is quite different from the other two plans that I used. Here, I'm not repeating the object and the shape. I'm only repeating the shape, but not the object of the spaceship. This shape that the spaceship has, which is angular, is repeated in the angular building in the background. You can see this similarity of shape here, you see? And then this shape here is here and here. You find these angles throughout the spaceship, and you find these angles throughout the building in the background. So there are angular shapes in the spaceship, and there are angular shapes in the building. Therefore, the same basic kind of angular shape in the spaceship has been repeated in a different object in the background. So the plan is repetition of shape, but change of object. But the building isn't the only object that has these angular shapes. It's also the foreground here. You see these angles here? They also repeat the shapes found in the spaceship and in the building in the background. So all of these shapes are basically angular shapes, and therefore they all relate to each other and create a unified composition because of that. There is a unity of shapes. There is actually too much rhythm of one kind of shape. If I continued to develop this rough sketch, I would introduce a counter rhythm of shapes, a contrasting shape. I think I'll introduce some curved lines and shapes just to show you how those contrasting shapes can really help to further enhance this color sketch, make it even more interesting. And this is what I talked about earlier, if you remember. Introducing a major contrast or major interval of shape. And I'm going to do that now. You see where those curved shapes and lines are? There's a curved shape here that contrasts with all these straight lines and angles. And then I introduced these curved lines here, again to contrast with the straight lines. And there's this circle here. So just by introducing a few curved shapes and lines, I've made this color sketch even more interesting because of the contrasting rhythm that now has been added, a rhythm of curves. This simple little rough sketch that I did here shows that same plan of repetition of shape with variation of object. And here you can easily see that the foreground triangular shape of the spaceship is repeated in a different object in the background, and those mountains have a similar triangular shape just as this spaceship has. When you repeat shapes like this, what happens is that you tie all of the parts of the composition together. You relate one part, this part relates to this part, and this part relates to this part, and this part relates to both of these, and this relates to both of these. All of the parts of the composition are related, connected, bind together into a unified whole through this repetition of shape. I'd like to point something out to you. I just added this black line on the spaceship. And by adding that black line, I divide the spaceship into another triangle shape. But not only does it serve to create another triangle shape, it also helps to create line continuation that locks the background with the foreground together. If you look at the edge of this building here, and you follow that edge downward, it is picked up by this black line, and that black line is then continued and picked up by the edge of the wing, thereby creating line continuation and locking the background with the foreground together into one unified plane. Now, if you're not familiar with line continuation, I suggest you check out Volume 6 of the Art Track video series, in which I extensively talk about line continuation. Not only do you find these triangular shapes in the objects, but also in the division of the picture area. If I divide the picture area by running along the edge of that building and then into that black line and to the edge of the wing and then over like this and up, I get the feeling that this shape is related to the triangle because of its long diagonal side. And then the other side of this shape also has this triangular look to it, or triangular character. Therefore, the picture area is divided into triangular shapes. Now, another important aspect of this composition that I'd like to draw your attention to, and that is that using parallel directions can bind one area of a composition with another. For example, the diagonal direction or oblique direction of the edge of this building is similar to the diagonal direction of the spaceship that you see here. These two diagonals, because they are going in the same direction, parallel each other. And because of that, they relate one to the other. And therefore, this part of the composition is related to this part of the composition. When using parallel lines, you need to use them in a way in which they will not become obvious. And they become obvious if you place them near each other like this. That is something that you must avoid because it results in monotony. And monotony results in a boring composition. There is too much sameness near each other in this example, and this is what must be avoided. But you can use parallel lines when they are farther apart and when they don't become obvious, like in this case. Also, making one line shorter and the other longer, like these, helps to make them less obvious looking. The use of parallel directions is a powerful compositional device that will relate one area to another, thereby binding them together into a unified whole. Just be careful that you don't create parallelism, too many parallels that become too obvious. This color sketch has, for its plan of organization, the design principle of harmony. When you establish harmony within your composition, it is harmony that dominates over the parts rather than the parts dominating. Therefore, you have imposed order upon the parts of the composition. Order is the result of relationships that you create, and harmony creates certain kinds of relationships that bring order to the elements of design. So when you create harmony, you are also creating a plan of organization for your composition. And harmony involves repetition, but varied repetition. And I've been showing you plans that involve repetition with variation. Within a plan of organization, more than one principle of design can be used, as I have already shown you, where I repeated an object and then varied its size. So I used the principle of design repetition as well as the principle of design gradation. The use of these two principles of design resulted in varied repetition. To give you another example, I could, for example, use harmony and also the principle of alternation together to form a plan of organization that will organize the elements of design: shape, value, direction, size, texture, and color. I'm showing you this other version of the sketch where I have this warmer color in the sky and the land area in order to point out to you that in this colored sketch, the plan of organization is also harmony, but in addition to that, also alternation. So both harmony and alternation have been used in this plan of organization to organize the elements of design. There is alternation of warm and cool color. This is a cool color. Then the colors in the background here are warm, and then this part of the composition is cool. So there's cool color alternating with warm color, except for the color on the man. I'm referring only to the color in the background, and then cool color again. In addition to that, there's an alternation of grayed violet, or more neutralized or muted, or as it's also referred to as semi-neutral color, alternating with brighter color here in this area, and then back again to more subdued or grayed colors. So it's grayed color, bright color, grayed color. The whole point of these plans of organization is to create order. So whatever it is that will bring order to the elements of design will be your plan of organization. But those things that will bring order are only the principles of design and nothing else. So your plan of organization must involve one or more of these principles of design. Otherwise, you don't have a plan of organization, and therefore you have no order in your composition. You just have a bunch of disparate, unrelated things thrown together that do not make a work of art. Here's the other version again. In this version, there's also alternation, but I used the other version because it is more obvious there. Here, there's also a warmer color in the background. The color appears warm compared to these other colors. So I also have a cool, warm, cool color alternation in this version of the color sketch as well. But it's not as strong as in the other one. In these plans of organization, as I have already mentioned, repetition plays the major part. There is always repetition involved in these plans, even if you're using harmony, because there is repetition within harmony, as I've already shown you. There is repetition in gradation. There is repetition in unity. There is repetition in alternation, but it is an alternated repetition. Even in balance, there can be repetition. Contrast is also involved in these plans to different degrees, as I've already shown you. Major and minor contrasts enter into these plans of organization. A plan of organization is also a design theme. So when you select one or more of these principles of design to organize your elements of design, that becomes the design theme. A design theme can be a plan of organization, it can be a symbol, or a pattern. However, the pattern or the symbol are plans of organization. So if I decide that my design theme should be a pattern, well, that pattern is created through the principle of design, repetition. So you see, you can't get away from using the principles of design. If I say that I want my design theme to be a symbol, Well, there again, repetition will be used because the symbol needs to be repeated throughout the composition. I'm going to do a rough sketch of a painting that was done by the great Norman Rockwell in order to show you how he uses a design theme based on a symbol, and that symbol is a vertical direction. And it is a painting of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln is standing next to this vertical pole, and Lincoln's pose is vertical. It has a vertical direction to it, repeating the vertical direction of the pole that he's standing next to. And this vertical symbol expresses dignity and strength, which are characteristics of Abraham Lincoln. But this vertical direction doesn't just appear in the pose of Abraham Lincoln. It also appears, as I've already mentioned, in the pole next to him, as well as these table legs from this table that is next to him. These vertical table legs echo or repeat the vertical direction of Lincoln, and the figures sitting next to him have a vertical direction as well, and they are looking up. So again, an upward movement in terms of implied direction, or psychological sightline, as it's called, when a figure is looking in a certain direction. That upward look by the figures near him help to strengthen or reinforce the upward direction of his pose, just as this pole next to him and these table legs reinforce that upward direction. So this upward direction is a symbol that is repeated throughout the composition in order to reinforce or strengthen the feeling of dignity and strength of the man. And here again, the principle of design, repetition, comes into play. The plan of organization involves repetition, as it always does in these plans of organization. Now, if I decide that my design theme should be a pattern, because pattern will organize the various shapes. If I use a pattern of darts, for example, by repeating a dark shape, I'm establishing a pattern. Something like this, for example, maybe these planes or spaceships. You see, repeating this shape and value creates a pattern, and this becomes my design theme. But this design theme, being a pattern, is the result of the principle of design repetition. So again, it's a principle of design that is used to create a plan of organization. In my video called IMA 4000 Volume 1, I talk a lot about design themes and show you different design themes and how they can be created within a composition. And as you can see, I cleaned up the pattern somewhat. Use your imagination in coming up with plans of organization. For example, you can use repetition to repeat a shape such as this. I'm using these abstract shapes now, very rough, and then later I'll turn them into something more recognizable. But in this way, I can quickly show you a plan of organization. These shapes, as you can see, have been repeated, and then this repetition can culminate in a dominant climax. that is dominant in terms of a large size, have all these smaller sizes, and then this plan culminates in a large dominant size. So it's repetition with variation and culminating in a dominant climax. The variation will occur in these sizes. Some will be larger, some smaller, but the largest one will be the one in which this plan culminates. This plan then involves more than one principle of design. It involves dominance and repetition with variation, which is actually harmony. Or it can be gradation, depending on the kind of variation that you introduce. Harmony and gradation are about change that is introduced. Each provides change in some way. Harmony in one way, gradation in another. As you can see, I've made those rough, abstract shapes more recognizable now, and it's just very rough. I'm not trying to do anything really pretty here. I'm just trying to show you the various plans of organization. And I want to encourage you to think creatively when coming up with these plans. Use your imagination. In this case, as I already pointed out, the plan is repetition with variation culminating in a dominant climax. There is variation of size, repetition of shape. The same shape has been repeated, but the sizes have been changed, and I used the principle of gradation to change those sizes, ranging from the culminating size to a smaller size to an even smaller size, and then to the smallest. So gradation has been used to create these variations in size. Remember, the whole point of these plans is to bring order to your composition. And the plan will do that by using the principle of design, repetition, as the plan of organization for this sketch. I am ensured that order will result because repetition tells me that I need to repeat this shape again and again. But if I want this plan to be interesting, that repetition must involve variation, as I have already pointed out previously. Variation can also occur within the individual shapes. The shapes need to be the same in order to ensure unity. However, within the shapes, variations can occur to make each shape different in some way, and thereby add more interest to the composition. For example, you could light these spacecraft in such a way that each shape receiving light is lighted in a slightly different way, thereby providing variation through lighting. Try to keep a strong identity of shape, but like I mentioned, variations within those shapes can occur. But the shape itself needs to have a strong identity in order for unity to occur. Otherwise, you won't get the feeling that there is a unity of shape, because the shapes will look too dissimilar. If you start changing the shape too much, I started this sketch with 6 shapes, but I changed that to 5 because it's more interesting to have an odd number of shapes than an even number. The odd number means that there is irregularity, a principle of irregularity at work in your composition, which helps to establish more interesting variety than an even number of shapes. I'm going to talk more about pattern as the design theme and plan of organization. A theme occurs through repetition. When something is repeated within your composition, that becomes the design theme. And what is repeated forms a pattern. So the pattern becomes the design theme. For example, as I showed you earlier with the painting by Norman Rockwell, where he paints Abraham Lincoln standing on the podium here, and Lincoln forms this vertical, and then he has, and then there is this vertical pole next to him, and the vertical table legs, and the figure also that's sitting next to him, that's vertical. So these verticals repeated are the pattern, and they therefore become the design theme, because whatever is repeated becomes the design theme and forms a pattern. The reason for doing this is because, first of all, it unifies the composition and it strengthens the mood, or the emotional state of the character is reinforced through the repetition of a motif such as this vertical. It is a motif. The motif can be anything: a vertical, a curve, a horizontal, a cross, a zigzag. Anything that is repeated within your composition becomes the design theme and forms a pattern. And the motif that you select needs to be one that reinforces the mood you have in mind and, as I already mentioned, expresses the emotional state of the character, or reinforces or strengthens that emotional state. This motif is a symbol. The vertical is a symbol. The horizontal is a symbol that expresses a particular mood. So you have to keep that in mind when selecting the motif that you're going to use in your composition that will form a pattern, that will be the design theme. You can discover what the motif should be that is repeated, and it will express the mood you have in mind when you just doodle around. Just start sketching something. Doesn't even have to be anything recognizable. You can see something within this sketch that can then become the motif. So doing this little doodle here, I find that it's made up of circular shapes, you see? And so now this becomes my motif that I'm going to repeat in other parts of the composition. It now forms a pattern because this circular shape has been repeated in other parts of the composition, and therefore this is my design theme, and the plan of organization is formed by the repetition of this motif. So I'm using the principle of design repetition plus variation of size. Repetition of shape, variation of size. The design theme is the circular shape. Be careful, however, that you do not create too much of one kind of rhythm. A pattern also forms a rhythm, and that rhythm has to be countered, or that motif that you keep repeating has to be countered by an opposing motif. So in a sketch like this, where there are a lot of these oval or circular shapes, I need to introduce an opposing rhythm or pattern or motif, such as the rectangle, for example. And that rectangle in the background now offsets the circular forms in the foreground and provides a contrasting shape or motif to all of these circular shapes. And it prevents the composition from having too much of one kind of rhythm or motif or pattern. And also there's a larger rectangular shape here. So there are actually two of them. And then I could repeat smaller ones somewhere else in the composition. So I have two motifs that contrast with each other, but one must dominate, which means that there needs to be more of one kind of motif than the other. And I talked about dominance in volume 8. If you didn't get a chance to see that volume, I suggest you check it out. A pattern isn't just what I showed you earlier, where I repeated these spaceships, repetition of an object and the value that forms a pattern. It can be a line. It can be a shape. It can be a value. A dark value is a symbol for a particular mood. When that value is repeated, a pattern is formed. Just like with these spacecraft that I showed you earlier. The dark spacecraft repeated. The dark value repeated forms a pattern. So it can be a value when repeated that forms a pattern. It can be a line that when repeated forms a pattern. It can be a shape that when repeated forms a pattern. It can be a color. By repeating the red, I'm creating a pattern of red. All of these elements of design that you see here, when repeated, form a pattern. A pattern is actually something that you hang a picture on. There is no picture without a pattern. The pattern is the picture. When you're drawing a particular pose, let's say there's this figure here and he has his arms up like that. This is the pose. Now, that pose sets up a pattern, and the pattern is these lines, these upward movement lines, and that pattern within this pose. Also, I could indicate something here. See, this line repeats the line formed by the arms, and that upward movement like that, that pattern should be repeated within the composition. Here I just very quickly indicated these forms here in the distance. They could represent buildings and that have that same curved upward movement that is found in the pose of the figure. You see? And this unifies the entire composition and reinforces and strengthens the mood set up by the pose of the figure. So this is very important, that you repeat the pattern found within the pose in other parts of the composition. But then you need to oppose this pattern, as I mentioned before, with an opposing motif. Otherwise you set up too much of one kind of rhythm. I could add a belt that has this curving line to it, repeating the curving line found in other parts of this pose. So this curving line is the pattern in the pose that's repeated. So to oppose this pattern, I could maybe add mountain tops here. See, this jagged line contrasts with the curving line. So I'm setting up an opposing pattern, and this jagged line needs to be repeated somewhere else in the composition. Maybe down here, you see. Something like that, maybe. I could also add a zigzag pattern to the clothing that he's wearing. Something like that, maybe. So now I've introduced an opposing pattern to the pattern formed by these curved lines, and thereby preventing too much of one kind of pattern from occurring within the composition. The upcoming examples that I'm going to be showing you also contain the repetition of lines and shapes that will be forming patterns as well. Another design theme that I can organize my composition with is a plan that involves a spiral. And the spiral is the result of gradation. The size gets smaller and smaller as it curves more and more. So gradation is involved in this plan. Here is a rough sketch based on that design theme of a spiral. And it starts here and moves around the edge of this tree to the edge of the leaves, and then the eye moves down to the building, over to the man, over to the building, and around and ends at his head, which is the center of interest. All these principles of design should be part of your composition. However, the plan of organization that you select will become the dominant principle upon which your composition is based. But all the other principles will also be within your composition, but it is that one dominates. For example, if I decide to use dominance in my plan of organization, I could have a large shape here, which dominates in size. You see, already it is this principle that is dominant. And then I can have smaller shapes back here, something like that. Maybe a few here. But the plan of organization is dominance, and that's the plan that dominates. Or my plan could be based on alternation, and that would then become dominant within my composition. For example, it could be something like this, some hills in the distance here, and then over here it could be water, and then there's some land area here, something like that. And there's a little figure that I added here that you can see. There's an alternation of light, then dark, then light again, and then dark again. And this plan becomes quite dominant. If I decided to develop this rough sketch into a finish, all the other principles of design that you see here will be present. However, my plan was based on alternation, and that is what will dominate. A question may arise in your mind that says, well, how do I know what the design theme should be? Where do I get the idea for the design theme from? Well, the best way to find out what the design theme should be is to look at your subject and try to discover what the basic character or essence of the subject is. And that's where the design theme will come from. For example, I may have in mind to paint a picture of military men standing there. That will be my subject, and from that I derive the idea for what the design theme should be. If they're standing there, I may think of them in terms of regimentation. And how do you get that idea across? Well, through repetition. The men are repeated. Therefore, my design theme becomes repetition. So they could be standing next to each other. It's very rough. Now, I don't have to create a lot of variation in their sizes. I can create interest through the changes that I make within the figures themselves, giving them different details, slightly different poses. One man could have his arm like that. Another has his arm hanging down to his side. Then one figure could be a little bit larger. Not too much, because this figure is slightly forward. So I'm introducing a little bit of variation in size, but not too much, because I want this feeling of regimentation. One figure could be a little darker, another a little bit lighter. So you see, I can introduce change within this plan of repetition without changing the sizes too much. You don't always have to have a great variety of different sizes. It all depends on what you want to accomplish, what kind of effect you want to create, what you have in mind. See, it doesn't always have to be like that large size and small size. In my case, I want to create this regimentation, this feeling of them standing there together like this. So it works better if I don't create a great deal of variety of sizes. Also, the spacing between the figures, the intervals of space can vary, can be different, and that also adds to the interest. So you see, you don't always have to have a great deal of variety of sizes, although most of the time that does work better. But in a case like this, you can still make this interesting through the changes that are made within these figures, as I pointed out. I might add that it is the plan that I based this composition on, which is repetition, that is the dominant principle. So for me, while thinking about these men standing there, the basic character or essence was regimentation, and that can best be expressed through repetition. And that's how I got the idea for that design theme. I have an idea in mind for another sketch, and I have an idea for a design theme. My idea is of a spaceship that is speeding along, and as I think about this spaceship and the speed at which it is traveling, it occurs to me that when planes move past the speed of sound, when they break the sound barrier, a sonic boom is created, and this reminds me of a curving line that would be symbolical of a sonic boom. And this line becomes my design theme. The curved sonic boom symbol will be repeated throughout the composition. So the principle of design repetition will be involved in this plan of organization. The basic character of this subject is speed, and it is this sonic boom curve that will help me to get this idea of speed across. Looking at this rough sketch, you get the feeling of tremendous speed of this spaceship, and these sonic boom curves help to create that feeling of speed. There's one here, and here, here, and here, and here. They're all over the composition. Although the design theme is a sonic boom curve on which this composition is based, it also is a plan of organization because I'm using the principle of design repetition, the repetition of the curve, and I'm varying the size of this curve. Therefore, it's repetition with variation of size. And it could also involve gradation, grading the sizes of these curves. There is also harmony, because harmony is varied repetition. When I mention gradation, there are two kinds of gradation. There is the regular or formal gradation, which progresses like this in a regular way from large to small, for example. Then there is the gradation that occurs in a composition in a more scattered way. It's not formal like this, but rather irregular. However, there are still these variations of sizes from large to small, except they occur in a more scattered way throughout the composition, rather than in a formal way like this. And this kind of informal or irregular gradation is what I would use in this composition here. A design theme brings order, and one of the design themes is a plan of organization. I don't want you to get confused between plans of organization and design themes. A design theme can be a plan of organization, or a symbol, or a pattern. But a symbol and a pattern also involves using the principles of design, because a pattern is created with repetition. And a symbol, such as the vertical line, is repeated, and it's repeated through repetition. So the principles of design are always involved in organizing the elements of design, or any design theme that you may come up with for your composition. As I have shown you in the previous examples, where I used the principles of design to organize the design themes. I brought back this example because I want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what a design theme is, because it is of the utmost importance. A plan, a symbol, or a pattern can be a design theme. Therefore, a principle of design can be a design theme, because a principle of design is a plan of organization for organizing the elements of design. And in this example, as I've already pointed out, it is alternation that is the plan of organization. Therefore, it is alternation that is the design theme, and the principle that is dominant. It's important that you're exposed to many examples of design themes so that you gain a thorough understanding of the importance of a design theme and where to get ideas for design themes. The idea for a design theme should ideally be derived from the basic character or essence of the subject, as I have already previously mentioned. But I'm repeating it because it is very important that you understand this. When you have a character in mind that you want to paint, it's important that you start out with an understanding of what the basic character or essence of that character is. For example, what is the state of mind of that character? Is this character a deranged, unstable character? If so, then you need to find a symbol that will express the state of mind of that character. And I'll show you how that can be done. I've talked about this in other volumes of the Art Track video series. So if you've been following the series, think back when I did these rough sketches of this figure with his head down and he's drooping, and then I repeated that same downward movement, something like this, in a tree or in some plants. This downward drooping directional movement is a symbol for sadness or dejection or depression. It expresses the state of mind of the character, and that state of mind is always an emotional state. And it is from that emotional state that the idea for the design theme of these downward movement lines, these drooping lines, is derived from. I have this character in mind that I'm going to do a very rough sketch of. And this state of mind of the character is a deranged one. It is a character that is quite unstable. Now, I need to get this idea across, because it can't just be shown in the expression of the face of the character. The whole composition must express this emotional state of the character, because the expression in the face is then strengthened and reinforced And it is intensified to such a degree that people looking at your character will feel this unstable emotional state much more strongly than if you just presented the expression of the character. I'm going to use a symbol, just as I used this downward drooping line here as a symbol to express emotional state. So I will use this triangle here that is tipping over, that is not balanced, to express the state of mind of a deranged, unstable character. Now, I'd like to point out to you that all of these elements of design here, they can act as symbols to express the state of mind of the character. It's not just a line or a direction or a shape, but a value or the size of your character or the color that you give your character. They all act as symbols to express the state of mind of your character. A dark value on the character can say that this is an evil character. This person has a dark side. As I thought about the character's emotional state and that he is unbalanced mentally, I thought of using a triangle that is not balanced, that is unstable, just as the state of mind of the character is unstable. My design theme is a symbol, and I used shape as that symbol. I'll repeat this triangle in other parts of the composition, and again, put the triangle off balance to reinforce this idea of being off balance. So I could start roughly sketching in the character on this triangle here, and the character is holding a weapon, a gun, something like this, very rough, and the leg is coming down like this, and the other leg is somewhat bent like this, coming down in order to get that feeling of a triangle off balance. The symbol is organized according to a plan of organization that involves repetition of shape, triangle, with variation of size, different size triangles, and then also dominance of size is also applied, and that is because of this large size of the figure. The other triangles that you see here, they can be part of a rock, for example, that he's leaning up against, that has a triangular shape to it, or triangles within that rock can be found. And as you can see, I've carried this sketch somewhat further so that you get a better idea of what it looks like and how these triangular shapes apply to it. As you can see, the triangle is formed by the pose of the man. And to increase this feeling of tipping over of an unbalanced state, I repeat that triangle in other parts of the composition in which these other triangles are also tipping over, are also in an unbalanced state. This repetition strengthens or reinforces this feeling of an unbalanced state, reflecting the unbalanced state of mind of the character. I'm applying a plan of organization to the design theme of the symbol by using repetition again, as it always occurs in these plans. And the repetition of the triangle shape is repeated, but the object is varied. Just as I showed you in an earlier example with the spacecraft, where the spacecraft had an angular or triangular shape to it that I repeated in the building. in the background. I had a plan of repetition of shape, variation of object, and the same occurs in this example. There is repetition of shape, but variation of object, because this triangle also appears in the building in the background, as well as in the rocks, which are a different object. So different objects, same shape. Also, there is dominance and variation of sizes of the triangle shape. So it could be said that this plan is repetition of shape with variation of size and object, culminating in a dominant climax. And that dominant climax is the man, of course, because he dominates in terms of size. As I was looking at this sketch, I realized something, that the feeling of unbalance, of tipping over of this triangle, was not sufficient enough. So, as I was looking at the sketch, it occurred to me that the rocks that he is leaning on help to prevent a greater feeling of tipping over, because the rocks are supporting him. So I went ahead and eliminated those rocks, and I think now there is a greater feeling of tipping over, which helps to strengthen this feeling that I want to get across, that he is unbalanced. Now the triangle seems to be more unbalanced. And something else I'd like to mention, this border here has a pull on this figure. It is pulling the figure. A border acts something like a magnet that pulls forms. So this also helps the feeling of tipping over, and also by adding more weight on this side, by darkening this side, I'm increasing the weight, and thereby the feeling of tipping over is increased even more. Of course, this is still a very rough sketch, and other things may occur to me as I develop it further. So you see, you can't always spot everything right away. As the sketch develops, you begin to realize certain things about it that you didn't see before, and then you make adjustments and changes, and the sketch goes through an evolutionary process. The creative process is an evolutionary process. You begin with rough sketches, and then they are refined more and more, and many changes are made along the way until you reach the finished painting. There are a few rocks here, and I could maybe add another one that will give him some support, but it is an uneasy support. And I think you'll agree that this version doesn't give you the feeling of tipping over or of an unbalanced state as much as this version does. Now for another example, I have this idea of a figure in the water. He's holding a gun above water, and there are crocodiles and lions, and he's in a forest, and the danger is all around him. So my design theme would be a surround theme to get this idea across. Basically, something like this. Here he is in the water, and then using these curves that are surrounding him as a basis for the composition that will tell me where I should position the objects that are surrounding him. Basically something like this. I'm not going to go much further because I want to give you more examples of design themes. There's an animal here, and he's on a limb looking down at the figure, and then an approaching crocodile over here. You get the idea. Also, to get his state of mind across, which is, in this case, nervousness and fear. The lines that you establish should have this kind of nervousness to it. You see, something like that. This irregularity. And you see it where I indicated here in the forest, and here, down here. And if I continue to develop this sketch, I would add more of these nervous-like lines to help get his state of mind across. This feeling of fear and danger in conjunction with this surround theme that I'm using. Now, moving on to another example. There are only three basic kinds of shapes: circle, triangle, and square. All shapes, no matter how regular or irregular they are derived from these three primary or basic shapes. Up to now, I've been showing you triangular shapes. Here, I did a rough sketch in which I wanted to show you rectangular shapes that are a derivative of the square. The triangular shapes are angular shapes because of the diagonal involved. The shapes are diagonal like this. But in a rectangular shape, the shape has these vertical and horizontal directions like this instead of the angle that a angular or triangular shape has. The shapes in this rough sketch have this rectangular character to them. Like that. And this rectangular shape is repeated in the buildings in the background. Like that. And even in this small figure here, there are these rectangle shapes. As you can see, these rectangular shapes are found throughout the composition, and this unifies all these shapes. The shapes that you establish in your composition need a strong identity. They shouldn't be vague, nebulous, or unclear. If they are like that, then you won't be able to establish a unity of shape. And I see so many paintings in which the shapes do not have a strong identity, and therefore they have no unity. One should be able to recognize whether they are circular shapes, triangular or angular, or rectangular shapes. And you can clearly recognize what my shapes are in this rough sketch. I talked a lot about shapes in my previous videos. Hopefully you got a chance to see those. If you didn't, you might want to check them out and learn more about shapes and their importance. Here again, like in some previous examples, the plan of organization is repetition of shape, repetition of rectangular shape, variation of object. The rectangular shape is repeated in the background buildings, as I've already stated, but the buildings are a different object. Repetition of shape, variation of object. But here again, as in previous examples, dominance of size is also involved, because there is this large dominant figure in the foreground. So it's repetition of shape, variation of object and size, culminating in a dominant climax. Variation of size occurs because there's this large figure in the foreground, then the smaller sized buildings in the background, and then the even smaller shape of the small man in the background. So far, I've shown you rough sketches with triangular or angular shapes and rectangular shapes, but I haven't shown you shapes that are curved. So that's what I'm going to do now. Before I do that, however, I'd like to point some things out to you about shapes. When you have shapes that are somewhat geometrical, like some of my rectangular shapes that I've shown you, the way I make that shape interesting is by cutting into that shape with another shape. Or it could be its background, something like that. You see, and by cutting into the shape, I've turned this geometric shape into a more interesting irregular shape. And then I can cut into it again to make it even more irregular and more interesting. Also, I can have some projections or things coming out of the shape like this, which therefore help to interlock the shape with its background and make it more irregular and more interesting. Also, with some of my sketches where I use a triangular shape. That triangular shape has to be made interesting by making it irregular. And the way I do that is by using another shape to cut into or overlap that triangular shape, and therefore turning that triangular shape into a more irregular shape, like this, see? But I can make it even more irregular by cutting into it with the background for that triangle shape, like that. And then now there's even more irregularity and therefore more interest, and also the shape now interlocks with its background. The point is, no matter what shapes you use, they need to be irregular. And sometimes I start out with an irregular shape in mind to begin with. Something like this, without starting out with a geometric shape and then turning that geometric shape into a more irregular shape. No matter what kind of shapes you use, just make sure that what you wind up with are irregular shapes. Just one more example. If you have a large shape and the shape is unbroken, something like this, even though, let's say, you have irregularities in that shape, the shape is not very interesting right here. It's boring, it's too monotonous. But by placing another shape on top of that shape, or in front of it, overlapping that large shape with some kind of other irregular shape, now you break up that large, boring, monotonous mass with this other shape that you placed in front of it, thereby creating a more interesting shape. Now this shape becomes irregular, you see, which makes this a much more interesting shape now. And that large, boring mass has been made interesting because of the other shape placed in front of it. And I did this with one of my rough color sketches, which I'll show you in a second. And here is the color sketch in which you can see the example of what I did to this large mass of buildings here. I felt it needed to be broken up by other shapes placed in front of it, like these trees here. By placing these irregular shapes of the trees against this large mass or shape of the building, I broke up that boring mass with these interesting irregular shaped trees, and thereby made the building more interesting by not having a lot of empty area here on the building that wouldn't be very interesting. Remember this when you're establishing large masses or shapes that need to be made interesting. And now I'd like to show you another example of a plan of organization that involves repetition with variation using curved shapes. And this time there's going to be this tree behind this figure that's standing in front of it. And it's going to be a large figure, and the figure is holding a knife, and behind her there is a figure approaching her that also has a weapon in his hand. Here is the finished rough sketch. It's very rough, but there's enough here that I can use to show you what the plan of organization is. And here, as in previous examples, it is repetition of shape with variation of size of that shape, as well as variation of object, culminating in a dominant climax, which is the center of interest. The dominant climax is always the center of interest, and in this sketch, it is this foreground figure that the plan culminates in. The shape that I chose to repeat in this composition is something like this, almost like the shape of stained glass windows in churches. And that shape is repeated in this background figure and in the building as well. Also in the plants that you see here in various sizes. So the sizes progress from large to smaller to even smaller. There is also variation of object, because not all the objects are the same that have this shape. Since there is also this progression of sizes of the shape, gradation is also part of this plan. Gradation of size. In actual fact, within a successful composition, all of the principles of design that you see here are involved. It's not just one or two or three principles. When I talk about plans of organization, as I mentioned previously, I am focusing on that principle or principles that seem to be most dominant within the composition, and that brings order to the composition. This shape in my composition is like a rounded triangle because it has these curves at the side. Remember what I said about shapes that are geometric looking. They need to be made into irregular shapes. And with my shape here, which looks geometric, like in this example right here, I cut into that shape with the knife that you see in the sketch, thereby making that shape an irregular shape. In addition, I added this dark tone that you see here, make it a little more dark, which again cuts into the shape and helps to make it even more irregular. Something like that. So now this shape, which would otherwise be a boring geometric shape, has become interesting because of the irregularity that I've introduced. This dark knife allowed me to cut into what would otherwise have been a rather boring shape. And actually the shape continues like that because of what's called passage. And I talked about passage in an earlier video where values that are the same or similar connect the shapes and turn two shapes into one shape or three shapes into one shape, depending on how many shapes you're using passage on. So here the value is very similar, and therefore it connects up with the value in the background, forming one shape instead of two, and thereby simplifying the pattern. And it continues around like this, like that. You see, adding a lot of irregularity to the shape and making it interesting. This could have been a very boring shape if I had not introduced this dark knife and this dark part here, and this light part creating passage. Passage is also created right here, where the dark value of the knife is similar to the dark of the tree in the background. And passage also occurs here, where the dark shadow on the figure merges or passes into the dark value of the tree. I darkened this shape just a little bit because I didn't want the passage to go into that shape. I wanted it to go into the background shape there, so that this kind of shape could be created. Another thing I'd like to point out is to make your shapes really interesting. Don't make the two sides of the shape the same. Otherwise, you wind up with a very symmetrical shape, and symmetrical shapes are not interesting compared to these kind of shapes, where each side is different. In addition, the edges of the two sides of a shape should be different to add variety and emphasis. The eye will go to that side of the shape that has the strongest contrast at the edge. For example, if I darkened the background here, the edge on this side is not as dominant, that is, does not attract as much attention as the edge on this side of the shape. And also, now I have variety, because one side of the shape has a stronger contrast at the edge, a sharper edge, while the other side of the shape has a softer edge, is less prominent or less dominant. So I have variety in terms of edges. Looking at my sketch here, I can see that I need to introduce more variety at the edge. This side of the shape, this edge, is too much the same as this side. They need to be different, as I pointed out here. So the way to do that is by adding more shadow here, darkening that edge. Now the two edges are different. There is more variety of edge, and therefore the shape becomes more interesting. If you look at this composition, you see irregular shapes everywhere. The sky is an irregular shape. Here I changed the sky area, as you can see. If the shape were like this, you see, more geometric, you would need to break it, like I showed you in my examples, to make it irregular. Make sure your shapes are irregular. You may start out with shapes that are more geometric, like I did here, but then they need to be turned into irregular shapes. Take a look at that shape and then the other one that's irregular that I have. See how much more interesting that shape is than this one? The shapes in this composition are curved shapes. Those are the kind of shapes that dominate. And you can see them here, here. The shapes are mostly curved. Here in the tree. The shape of the tree is curved, and it is an irregular shape, as you can see, making this an interesting shape. If I want to know what the character of a shape is, I don't look at all the little irregularities at the edge of the shape. I simplify the contour of the shape, like that, you see? And you outline the shape like that, avoiding all these little irregularities. You don't do this. You need to simplify the contour, and that can be done by just hitting the high points of all those irregularities like that. And that tells you what the character of the shape is. And here you can see it's a curving character. So avoid all those irregularities at the edge and then just focus on the simple contour that will then give you the character of the shape. To give you another example, let's say there's this landscape and it has mountains like this, irregularities. Well, to find out what the shape is, you don't do this. You need to simplify the contour, and you just hit certain high points like that, and you find out what the shape is. You see, it has this rhythmic line to it. But you wouldn't see that if you focused only on the irregularities or details of the contour. You need to see the contour in simple terms, and then you'll see that there is this rhythmic line here. All these shapes that I repeat in the composition set up a rhythm. But that rhythm needs to be opposed by a counter rhythm, and I mentioned this before, which means that a contrasting shape needs to be introduced that also sets up a rhythm. Otherwise, there's just too much of one kind of shape. And that shape needs to be balanced with a shape that will bring relief to the composition, as I've already mentioned previously. In this rough sketch, that opposing shape is this knife here. And this knife forms an opposing shape to all these curved shapes throughout the composition. thereby providing relief and also emphasis, because the eye of the viewer is drawn here, where this angled shape occurs because of the strong contrast that is the result of these straight lines opposed to the curves found in the figure. So the eye is attracted to this part of the composition because of that. These mountains in background have an angular character to them like that, you see. So they also contrast with the more curved shapes. Now, I could add maybe another angular shape, maybe in this part of the figure, something like that maybe, and that would repeat this angular shape and help to set up a rhythm of angular shapes opposing the curved shapes. So I have a counter rhythm, something like that maybe. Now, looking at this shape here, change this to red, it looks a little too regular to me. I need to have a part of this shape that is a little more irregular. And so I have to think about how I can do that. Maybe have this hood come into his face a little bit more, something like that. Or something here that intrudes into this dark part of the shape, setting up a more irregular shape. And also this here could be a little more irregular. And if you notice, this shape forms a kind of arrow which points down to the hand, and then the hand helps to lead up to the knife, and the knife over to the figure in the background. See that? So there's a movement here, a compositional movement, an eye path, as it's called. Using a plan of organization that involves gradation, but not in a scattered or irregular way that I've shown you, but rather in a sequential way, like this, where there's a gradual change progressing from large to smaller size, or it could be a value, progressing from a dark to a lighter value, like that, or a direction, progressing from a vertical to one that's a little angled, a little more, and so on. Gradation applies to all of the elements of design. Or it could be a color, progressing from red to red-violet to violet, for example. Or a line that changes from a curve to a straight line. Gradation involves extreme contrasts such as the curve and the straight line, as well as more closely related or more harmonious contrasts which occur between adjoining pairs within the sequence, as these curves here, or these colors here, or the values here. The adjoining parts are similar and harmonious, but then as the sequence progresses, they become more and more dissimilar, and a major interval of contrast then occurs. With shape, for example, you can have a circle slowly progressing toward an oval, like that. Then there is gradation of texture, such as you see here, for example, where the texture progresses from a very rough texture to a very smooth texture. Gradation is a sequence in which the contrasting extremes are bridged by a series of similar or harmonious steps. The textures that adjoin each other have only slight differences between them. They are similar, and therefore they are in harmony, because harmony is the result of similarity, where the contrast isn't as great as the contrast between the extremes within a gradation. When it comes to plans of organization, gradation can be used in a way in which I'll indicate now. I could have a figure here and another figure here, but a little smaller. So there's a gradation of size, repetition of shape, and object. The same object, which is a figure, is being repeated, and then another figure, a little smaller this time. So as you can see, there's a progression of size. The shape will be the shape of a figure, repeated, and then apart from this group, in order to focus on the center of interest, I could have a figure separated from this group here. And because of the isolation of this other figure, this figure now becomes the center of interest. And these figures lead through the eye path to the center of interest. When you separate a shape from a group of shapes, you need to connect them somehow. You can do that by adding a shape in the background, a hill or a wall or something that will connect them, something like that. I'm going to keep these sketches very rough and suggestive because I'm just interested in focusing on showing you plans of organization and not pretty pictures. I'm providing just enough information so that you can see what the plan looks like in these sketches. This plan of organization is repetition of shape and object with variation of size through the principle of gradation, culminating in a dominant climax, which is this figure here. So you see, there are more than one principle, like repetition, involved in this plan. There is also gradation as well as dominance. It doesn't have to be a huge size. That is, a dominance of size in order to culminate in a dominant climax. Not something like this. It can be a smaller size, but it can become dominant because of strength of contrast. A greater value contrast or intensity of color could occur. Like this. You see now, the eye is attracted here. Even though this figure is much larger, it dominates in size. It is this figure that truly dominates because it attracts more attention than these other figures do. Or instead of dark like this, I could make it light in value and then the background darker. Something like that. And the contrast of value would have to be stronger than what's on these figures here. A dark background against the light value of the figure. And now the figure becomes dominant through the light value contrast instead of the dark value contrast. The plan of organization provides order through gradation and repetition. And because a plan of organization has been used to organize this composition, it is the plan that dominates over the parts rather than the individual parts dominating. When using gradation, it's not just gradation of size, where the shapes get smaller and smaller. Also, gradation of value can be introduced, or gradation of color. Here, the values get lighter and lighter as they progress into the distance. Here is another example of a plan of organization based on the principle of design gradation. And as you can see, there's a large figure in the foreground, and then the figures get progressively smaller as they move into the distance. There's also a gradation of value. The dark value on the foreground figure, and then the value gets progressively lighter. Besides the gradations that I've pointed out, others can be introduced, such as color or texture, for example. Now, this plan consists of repetition of shape and object, again, like the previous example, the object is the figure that is repeated. But there is variation in the pose of each of these figures in order to create interest. Each new figure that is introduced into a gradation plan of organization such as this needs to have a different pose in order to create as much variety of poses as possible to ensure maximum interest. Repetition, gradation, but also harmony is involved here, because remember what I said about gradation, that those elements of design, value, shape, size, texture, direction, that are close to each other within a gradation or adjoining each other are in harmony, and those farther apart from each other contrast sharply with each other. Therefore, both major and minor contrasts exist within a gradation, making it, therefore, very interesting because of the variety of contrasts. The introduction of both major and minor intervals of contrast are one of the chief means through which maximum interest can be established within a composition. And now for another example of a plan of organization based on gradation, and that rough sketch could consist of maybe a large head in the foreground with another head behind that head, which is smaller, and the heads progress to smaller sizes as they move into the distance. Now also I could indicate some spacecraft, and they too could be progressing in size like this, from larger to smaller. Now you can see more of what these forms look like. The sketch is still very rough, but there's enough here so that you can see what the gradation plan looks like when more recognizable forms have been indicated. When you establish a gradation plan like this, you're ensuring that the composition will be orderly and that the parts will not dominate over the plan. It is the plan that will dominate over the parts. Because of the similarity of the parts, harmony is ensured, as well as more major intervals of contrast. Just make sure that each succession of a unit is not radically different from the one next to it, because if they look completely different, except for size difference, you lose all the other gradations involved, and you also lose the harmony and unity that could result from such a gradation plan of organization. For example, instead of this head here, I indicate a spaceship, just very quickly and roughly, triangular spaceship, something like that. And now no longer have this gradation of the heads, because the spaceship is now intruding. Now there is alternation instead of gradation. The head alternates with the spaceship, and then back again to a head. So the progressive sequence that existed before, that enabled this arrangement to be harmonious and unified, now no longer exists. You need to have forms that are not radically different from each other to achieve harmony and unity, and that will occur if you use gradation as a plan of organization. The plan is easily visible and therefore dominates over the parts. You need to, however, introduce enough change within the gradation where you don't repeat each shape exactly the same. And that's not what I did with these heads. As you can see, each head has a different pose. Each looks different. Even though there are these various differences, I didn't lose the plan of gradation because there are still enough similarities here to keep the plan. The same form of the head is repeated, which is oval. The same curving shapes are found. In each head, there is still enough similarity, enough that's repeated, so that the gradation plan is not lost.